In March 2024, I watched episode 1, 2, 3, and 4 with hope that the producers of the Netflix series The American Conspiracy, The Octopus Murders, had kept their promise made to Trey Casolaro and myself years earlier that they were going to produce a credible TV documentary series that would expose the truth and help win justice for Trey Casolaro and his father. At the end of the 4th episode, my heart sank and I immediately rang Bill Hamilton and Nancy Hamilton, owners of Insular Inc., who I'd been working with for over 24 years, warning them to be prepared that they've been thrown under the bus by the producers of the Netflix series and that they're slandering them. I also contacted Michael Riconosciuto, who I'd been working with for 20 years through letters in prison and thousands of telephone calls and interviews that I've done with him, warning him also that they've thrown him under the bus and are slandering him. It was with great sadness that an opportunity was lost to tell the truth, to present the facts for the public to make their own decision about what is the truth. Christian Hansen, Zachary Treats state categorically the only person in the room with Danny Casolaro that could have killed Danny Casolaro is Danny Casolaro. They also state we have never seen any evidence that confirms he didn't commit suicide. In follow-up interviews that I arranged, they state categorically we believe it's a 51% versus 49% probability that he committed suicide versus he was murdered. In this podcast, and I'm going to do about 4 to 6 podcasts because I'd like the public to know the truth. The truth of what evidence they did learn, the promises that they made, and the bias of their whole TV series, which they have an insult to call a documentary. It really is a fantasy story of Christian Hansen believing that he looks like Danny Casolaro, has acting lessons to act, and wears a hat and films himself pretending to be a credible investigative journalist by the name of Danny Casolaro, who gave his life as a truth seeker. Even on Wikipedia now, in the first paragraph now, they've inserted themselves in here. After it talks about Joseph Casolaro dies on August 10th, 1991, was an American freelance writer who came to public attention in 91 when he was found dead in a bathtub in room 517 at the Sheraton Hotel in Martinsburg, West Virginia, with his wrists slashed 10 to 12 times on both sides. The medical examiner ruled the death a suicide. And there they are, a Netflix documentary titled American Conspiracy, The Octopus Murders, is centered around the Casolaro case. It's an absolute insult for them to be given any credibility on the page dedicated to Danny Casolaro. Throughout 2018 to 2024, I have all the forensic evidence of telephone calls that I recorded with them when they were soliciting full access to 24 years of my credible research investigations, our recorded interviews with thousands of interviews with witnesses, documentary evidence, legal evidence that we hold and have recovered from government archives, from CIA official reports, lawyers court cases in America and also royal commissions, several of them in Australia, cabinets of governments, and particularly my recorded podcasts that they were provided advance opportunity to watch and look at the evidence and listen to my analysis. I have all of their encrypted signatures. I have all of their registration and all the documentation saying how credible and knowledgeable I am in all of these areas to do with the Promis software, the Echelon network, and the investigations of Danny Casolaro. They have seen all the evidence that I'm going to present to you across 4 to 6 documentaries, and then you can, as a public, make your own determination what is fact and what is fiction. They promised they were totally committed to producing a credible TV documentary series to publicly expose the truth about the Promis software affair and the death of Danny Casolaro. I can state categorically they deceived and lied to Trey Casolaro and me. They were fully aware that in June 2019, I had actually confidentially written to the original detective, George Swartwood, who undertook the investigation. It's many pages long, but it does confirm my credentials, my credibility, and telling him categorically that I've interviewed witnesses that he didn't ever interview, and many of them were speaking to Danny Casolaro on the very day of August 9th, lunchtime, just before he meets with Bill Turner. And he had recovered 5 boxes of documents from the IRS Computer Center in Martinsburg. The witnesses confirmed categorically he was excited. He believed he had all the evidence now to expose the octopus, that he was meeting with Bill Turner to retrieve 2 folders of documents, and he would call them first thing Monday when returning home to follow up with his investigations. It was quite clear in my offer to collaborate with George Swartwood that I had the evidence, I had the documents, and these people were prepared to testify in any court. Instead, his attorney writes back to me, telling me that the files are still sealed, but not responding to my offer to help. All the evidence that I'm offering is the same evidence that Christian Hansen and Zachary Treats had full access to before they started producing the Netflix series. In fact, coincidentally, it's at the same time. More important, they continue to solicit more evidence from me, with more promises being made right up to 2020. I provided this correspondence copy to Tony Casolaro, the brother, on the advice of my interviews with former FBI agent Thomas Gates, who said that if I believed that Danny Casolaro was murdered, so does his brother, and I should approach him to get his support. I did, and then, to my horror, he tells me he gave all of the evidence that I provided to the Martinsburg police to Anne Klink. I have all my correspondence and recorded interviews with Tony expressing nothing but disgust. The last person I wanted my evidence going to was Anne Klink, and I have justified reasons for having reservations, as I've triggered many parliamentary inquiries in Australia to expose corruption, and we have some pretty strict rules that you never have anyone with potential conflicts of interest involved in any shape or form, or you compromise the integrity of calling them independent. I have been working for 24 years with Gordon Savell, who's a veteran Canadian investigative journalist and film producer. I'm a credible Australian physicist, and my understanding of the technologies and first-hand experience with the companies that sold the Promis software to Australia is how I became involved with this story when I picked up the telephone and spoke to Bill Hamilton for the first time in December 2020, introducing myself. In 2004, I start communications directly with Gordon and myself by letters with Michael, and Michael starts to divulge to me, because he's excited, I am a qualified physicist, mathematician, and worked in very advanced technologies of computing and also software development, and understood the modifications that he was making. He shared with me all of the evidence of what he had declared under oath in court. In fact, provided me with thousands of pages of the transcript of court, and I went through those and was able to independently validate the things that Michael was saying were true in Australia. And the things that Bill was saying were also true. Unlike Christian Hansen and Zachary and Anne Klink and Cherie Seymour, they have produced a Netflix series which is to smear and slander their reputations, question everything they have, and it's just a complete fraud. They were the trusted sources of Danny Casolaro. And Danny Casolaro, in his notes, had the biggest stories, and his trip that they said he was going to make in the Netflix series, they said he was going everywhere except Australia. That was deliberate by Christian Hansen and Zachary. They didn't want any reference to Australia because that means that they were dealing with me for many years and knew my evidence was credible. And in fact, the omission is an idea of how I judge credibility and integrity. It's what people leave out of their documentary that they know to be true, tells you everything you need to know about their motives to tell the truth. Danny Casolaro's trip was 7 days. All other destinations were 2 or 3 days, but he was going to come to Australia for 7 days. He wanted to meet with the Queen's Counsel, to the Nugan Bank Royal Commission, the Costigan Royal Commission, and he was even aware of 1991 August that Ari Ben-Menashe was testifying before another Royal Commission, which was the evidence of a $6 million cheque being transferred across to media baron Alan Bond by Richard Babin, working for Richard Secord on behalf of Earl Bryan, who happens to be Anne Klink's boss. And that was for the payment of the covert transfer of the Iran-Contra arms through the ports of Australia, and reward for the installation of the Promis software sold to the Australian government. Given that I had all that evidence and had included it in all of my podcasts that Christian Hansen and Zachary had watched, and I have all the forensic evidence of them registering, watching it, downloading it, to leave it out of their Netflix series and to omit the fact that he was coming to look into Nugan Bank. He was also going to return and go to prison, one of the prisons, to interview Ed Wilson, particularly his intimate knowledge of the Promis software and the arms and drugs going through the Nugan Bank in Australia. I will prove to you the evidence that they had seen. That's the Christian Hansen, Zachary, and my serious reservations. I never was told by these people that they were working with Cherie Seymour or Anne Klink. Had they, I would have refused to provide them with any of my evidence. And so hence I believe that they've undermined the integrity of reopening a homicide investigation as I had clearly offered to the Martinsburg police. And to see the Martinsburg police handing the evidence across to Christian Hansen on camera is a complete insult given what Gordon Savelle and I did in 2004. We were publishing a book. It was called Born Classified, and it's the evidence that Earl Bryan, Rupert Murdoch, and Robert Maxwell were the media barons selling the Promis software to spy on foreign governments and citizens. We have hundreds of interviews with credible witnesses, governments, intelligence agency, law enforcement, and the very closest friends involved with the Promis software and the investigations being done by Danny Casolaro. 80% of our witnesses had been deceased when Christian Hansen and Zachary Treats had come to see us. Not only that, they had put a USB key into the computer of my colleague, Gordon Savelle, promising that they want to reveal the truth, and they had a complete copy of our draft manuscript for the book, which summarizes the full analysis, details, and names of all our interviews, and hence they knew what we already had on tape and had put into our book, and they were running around trying to see if they could get these people to trust them to say the same thing as if it's original for Christian Hansen and Zachary. Many of the witnesses told us categorically they didn't trust them, that they're inexperienced, that they have no understanding of all this, and had declined to be interviewed. There's our original access for freedom of information filed in 2004. We were prevented from getting access to the records because we were told that it had been sealed. And we could not understand why an investigation that has come to the conclusion that Danny Casolaro, there were no threats being made against him, that he wasn't investigating anything that would put his life at risk, had simply been depressed, that he'd gone down to Martinsburg with a couple of shoelaces, some plastic bags, and some razor blades for the purposes of committing suicide. It made no sense to us, and we were being blocked back in 2004. Christian Hansen knew that, so he files his application after meeting us in 2014. And when we reveal our summary, this is a summary that Gordon has written that I'll read out, and I want to read it out for the audience. Gordon Savelle is a veteran Canadian investigative journalist and film producer. He trusted them, I trusted them, and this is how he would categorize and summarize the approach taken by Christian Hansen and Zachary Treats. He says, periodically, if you work in the television or film industry, you may get the opportunity to make a difference, a chance to leave a mark with your audience, which is truly a blessing. Film is an art form, but the message conveyed must be appropriately considered when scripting. It is the calling to send a message, is how Tom Hanks regarded Saving Private Ryan and his HBO series, Band of Brothers. The Hollywood legend, along with Steven Spielberg, relayed the truth about a chapter in history which encompassed the hardships for so many young men who sacrificed everything to make a difference. As an episodic television producer and documentary filmmaker for Discovery Channel, with 5 seasons and nearly 100 shows behind me, I have personally embraced that privilege. I consider filming a powerful conduit to impart ideas and provoke thought among audiences. They're crafted with the intention to raise awareness, challenge societal norms, or inspire change. Films are in many ways a huge responsibility because viewers are trusting the storytellers to get it right. And that's critically important in non-fiction documentaries. Examples of how to inform and impact on the corporate, political, and justice systems, which to truth include Making a Murderer, Take Care of Maya, or The Hitler and Nazis Evil on Trial as seen on Netflix. These docudramas each boasted intrinsic journalistic and historical impact without publicly humiliating the participants and without freewheeling vulgar profanities, liberally sprinkled throughout the productions. The 2024 Netflix series entitled American Conspiracies, The Octopus Murders led viewers on a journey through the eyes of Hansen, who spent 10 years researching Casolaro's life between 1990 and 1991. While the visual elements and the editing were well crafted, the four-part series took many liberties with the truth. And as a result, this angered a number of people who engaged with the two New York City residents. The pair leaned heavily on others who investigated many years before them in order to develop sources and gain an understanding of the intricacies of what is a terribly complex storyline involving many nations, governments, intelligence agencies, and shadowy customers tied into murders, covert trafficking of weapons, narcotics, and money laundering. The two filmmakers who brought Netflix the case of Danny Casolaro sorely missed the mark. It was journalistically shallow, and utterances were made that should not have gone unchecked. Zachary Treats and Christian Hansen spent years working on their series, but tragically did the public a massive disservice. In the writer's opinion, they actually squandered a rare opportunity to reveal the significant investigative research Danny Casolaro uncovered as a relentless truth seeker, with nobody but himself to rely upon. He sacrificed everything he valued in life, while the Netflix conspiracy film showcased his crusade for justice while affording some talking heads a chance to trash his work. I think that summarizes it eloquently. The series threw Casolaro under the bus as little more than a conspiracy chaser. Hansen considered his sources unreliable or insane to amplify his verbiage. The perseverance, skills and outcomes of Casolaro's research into sensitive issues involving ruthless political figures clearly demonstrated Casolaro is and always will be worthy of significant praise, not ridicule and mockery. In truth, he covered more ground in 1 year than many journalists achieve in a lifetime. But whatever you do, don't base his work on the Netflix series because they failed to understand his successes. I first met Christian Hansen in 2014 when he is introduced to me and he makes his telephone call to win my confidence. I said, I know how William Hamilton, Michael Riconosciuto, Gordon Savell and myself are directly involved in the investigation of the Promis software story. Why are you interested in this story given you were not even born during these major events that Danny Casolaro was investigating? And Christian Hansen's response is, I'm interested in researching Wackenhut. I recently booked myself into room 517 at the Sheraton Hotel in Martinsburg, West Virginia, where Danny Casolaro died. I stayed in the room for the entire night, and I feel that I have some kind of connection with Danny Casolaro. I immediately thought to myself, this is creepy. I can categorically say in 2014 and in 2024, Christian Hansen has no direct knowledge or understanding of the CIA NSA Echelon network or the modified Promis software applications that Danny Casolaro was exposing. Throughout 2018 to 2024, Christian Hansen and Zachary Streets requested access to my 24 years of credible research investigations, recorded interviews with witnesses, documentary evidence, and my recorded podcasts. They promised that they were totally committed to producing a credible TV documentary series to publicly expose the truth about the Promis software affair and the death of Danny Casolaro. They deceived and lied to Trey Casolaro and me. Who am I? I'm a highly credible international research physicist with expertise in medical technology, scientific and encryption technologies. In fact, I represented the Rosetta encryption technologies, the chip and smart cards and security that was designed specifically for CIA, NSA and FBI and DIA exclusively in Australia and Asia in 1997 through to 1999. I'm also the former Science and Technology Policy Advisor to the Australian Federal Liberal Party, appointed in 1995. I believe Christian Hansen and Zachary were probably 5 years of age at that stage. I was also a witness to an Australian Federal Committee of Privileges that was investigating threats made against me involving a company owned by Rupert Murdoch that did sell the Promis software to the Australian government. I was employed by them. I was a principal consultant working for them, and I'm the whistleblower who is exposing what they did in Australia. In 1998, my company's encryption business ventures that I had established with United Nations SEAL program. SEAL stands for Secure Electronic Authentication Link for all trade and medical services worldwide with all countries, in partnership with the Australian federal government, were destroyed by CIA Operation Stillpoint. And I have podcasts on that, which Christian Hansen has watched and Zachary has watched, which proves that I was intimately involved in exposing the Promis software being used for money laundering of arms and drugs through all Australian banks. Citibank, Bankers Trust, Deutsche Bank, and BCCI, and the Nugenhan Bank back in the late 70s and early 80s. I've completed 24 years of interviews and research investigations into the Promis software affair. So I'm not someone growing my hair to look like Danny Casolaro. I'm not taking acting classes to see if I can do some selfies of myself pretending that I am Danny Casolaro. I'm not wearing a hat that he gave as a gift. I'm not trying to pretend that I'm Danny Casolaro. I was trying to win justice for Trey Casolaro and Danny Casolaro because he was a brilliant investigative journalist and writer, He had all the evidence, and I've proven that through a series of podcasts, almost 50 now. And these have been readily available since 2022. They were released earlier to Christian Hansen, Zachary Treats, in order for them to use them as evidence to help me open a homicide investigation for Trey Casolaro to win justice for his father, who we believe was murdered. There's far more evidence of a murder than there is suicide. In 1995, I worked for Honourable John Howard, who was the leader of the Australian Federal Liberal Party, and I was appointed to write the policies for science and technology for the whole of Australia. At this stage, I believe Zachary Treats and Christian Hansen are 5 years of age, and I think starting primary school. On my website, which Christian Hansen and Zachary have been reviewing. In fact, they had advance copy and access with encryption streaming and folder set up for their registered email addresses with their correspondence confirming they've watched them for podcasts 1 to 9. The first podcast shows the overwhelming evidence of the motive to kill Danny Casolaro. The second podcast is the interview that I did with the last girlfriend of Danny Casolaro, who was never interviewed by Martinsburg Police, the FBI, or Department of Justice, confirming that she was invited to stay with the Crown Prince and Prime Minister of Kuwait at the Watergate Hotel during the week that Danny died. And she even filed a Freedom of Information access request to the CIA, which all that information, the recorded interviews with Jack Blum, and also who was the investigator for BCCI, the recorded interviews for Wendy, the last girlfriend, the podcast showing that Robert Booth Nichols came to Australia in 2004, 10 years before I ever met Christian Hansen, making death threats against me, given that I was exposing the Promis software. And they also watched the podcast showing that all the evidence that Danny Casolaro was investigating relating to the dismissal of Gough Whitlam with all the spies in Australia involving Robert Booth Nichols, Michael Hand, Frank Colucci, Ted Shackley, William Colby, and spies Sir Harry Gillam and Eric C. Cowles, including the supporter of Gerald Ford and Henry Kissinger, and the Prime Minister of UK and the Queen, was validated by me, and it's all in Danny's notes. And also definitive proof that I have proven through all the Royal Commissions and Australian Federal Cabinet documents the definitive links of Michael Riconosciuto's companies with Cabazon, Wackenhut, Paul Maraska's company, and Robert Booth Nichols' arms companies were directly working with Michael Hand, Frank Nugan, and other parties for gold bullion with the Nugan Hand Bank in Australia, plus arms deals and arms demonstrations were made available to Christian Hansen and Zachary to prove that everything Michael had testified in court, Michael Riconosciuto, thousands of pages, sworn statements, I was confirming. In fact, the documents that Cherie Seymour is holding, she has no idea what it means. She has no idea what the relevance is. She's no expert. She has also undermined justice for Michael, his wife, and their attorney to win his freedom for 26 years. And also the TV footage of me in major documentaries investigating fraud and exposing CIA Operation Still Point. using the Promis software. If you visit my website, the6i.org, and podcasts, you'll be able to watch all the evidence that Christian Hansen and Zachary had but did not show you as the public. And I would love to speak with the attorneys of Netflix to see if they were told about it, because when you go off and slander Michael Riconosciuto and Bill Hamilton, and now they're slandering me publicly, I don't believe that the attorneys were told the truth. My website was endorsed by Trey Casolaro. My father was a brilliant investigator and he was murdered for revealing the truth. I have also got endorsements from the musicians and best friends of Danny Casolaro, and they've dedicated their music to his memory. They believe that he was murdered. Unlike growing my hair, getting acting lessons to pretend that I'm Danny Casolaro, my story is about Promis software in Australia. And you will find it started back in 97 when a bogus prince turned up working with CIA, money laundering, and making a donation of $1 billion. Not 1 million, 1 billion live on TV. And it's me that exposed that he was working with CIA to destroy our credible encryption and security trade network worldwide with the United Nations and the Australian government. I'm the witness being threatened. I contact Bill Hamilton for the first time in December 2000 to introduce myself. I launch a federal police investigation against the parties that had defrauded my encryption companies and discover that they're all involved with the Promis software with CIA. I'm contacting Michael Riconosciuto. He's so relieved to have someone who understands what Promis is, what Echelon is, and the modifications, so he can open up and speak freely for the first time. Whilst doing that, I have agreements. Former President Gerald Ford appears, and he signs agreements that he wants to negotiate a $100 million settlement for me in June 2004. In November 2004, there are two TV documentaries. Our ABC TV channel documentary, SBS TV, are all about me. And I've got the correspondence back from Christian Hansen and Zachary saying they watched them. They were so impressed they couldn't believe that a credible organisation called the Johns Hopkins Medicine Institution and universities could have done that to me, and allegations of serious fraud and cover-up. And then they're watching the podcast of Robert Booth Nichols coming to Australia to make death threats against me. And also they're aware that apparently Paul Wolfowitz and the neocons, Richard Pearl, Douglas Faith, and Scooter Libby are all upset with my investigations and Gordon's investigations exposing the Promis software. That's just prior to him being appointed to as a new president for the World Bank. It's interesting that Danny Casolaro had all the evidence on the World Bank, and so did I. And then later on in 2005, I discovered the CIA agents, and I've got all the transactions of the Promis software going through all the banks, relating back to what happened to us in 97. And then in 2018, I find the evidence of CIA Kuwait linked to the death of Danny Casolaro. They financed the BCCI checks that he had. And surprise, surprise, this is when Christian Hansen and Zachary find out that I've got it, and they contact me again because they want to put it onto the TV show that they're producing. Danny Casolaro, all of his investigations were predominantly about Nugan Bank, BCCI, Wackenhut, and the dismissal of Gough Whitlam in Australia, the democratically elected, was the same octopus right through, including the TOW missiles for BCCI, the Iran-Contra arms and drugs, but also a $2 billion brokers of death arms deal. Danny had the smoking gun. These are the documents that Oliver North was trying to destroy. And also Indochina report, customs report, linking further evidence of links of mafia, CIA, drugs and arms, and drugs coming out of Kuwait. And then predominantly it is leading to the Promis software being installed at Citibank for Swiss banking. None of these things were really touched on at all. And I had dedicated all of my research and podcasts to the memory of Danny Casolaro. I have not made $1. I've spent almost every day for 24 years with Gordon Savell. We never chased the money. We weren't trying to get fame. We didn't want to act a role as if we're selfies. We were just trying to expose the truth and the injustices done against Bill Hamilton and his family, Michael Riconosciuto in prison, and even worse is Danny Casolaro was murdered. And the culprits, the people behind it, were still alive. Many of them have passed away, but some are still alive today, and that's why it should have been an active homicide, given the evidence that we're holding. And I was disgusted when I sat there watching it, and there's Anne Klink calling Michael Riconosciuto a creep. And then you've got them boasting about the research that they've done with Cherie Seymour. They never told me that they were doing their production with Netflix. They never told us that they were working with Anne Klink to help them produce it. They never told us that they were working with Cherie Seymour. Had they, I would have flatly refused. But no, they came soliciting more evidence from me. And the whole conspiracy narrative rejected anything that could have hinted that there were motives, evidence of death threats against Danny, more than 2 to 3 motives to kill him. The damaging evidence that's sitting in the folders that Anne Klink claims that she was told to take away from the scene of the crime all of his evidence when she thought that he might have been murdered or heard that he had been murdered or killed. I have really serious issues with the processes of how the American justice system works, because it's just wrong. It's absolutely wrong. In my next podcast, I will reveal to you our recorded interviews with Bobby Riconosciuto and Michael's attorney, Lou Baffardi, on the record categorically stating that Cherie Seymour deceived Michael's wife to give her the documents for safekeeping, the original documents, and that she refused to return them. And that Bobby believes, and Michael's attorney, who's now deceased, but we've got our recorded interviews, we'll play them in the next episode, believe that it was unlawful for her to take them, and 2 is that she undermined justice for Michael. And to prove that to you, I have all my interviews recorded with Cherie Seymour in 2016. I have all my email correspondence with her and her publisher, Chris Milligan. She did not tell us that she was producing a film with Christian Hansen and Zachary. She told me and Gordon in writing that she knows that we're highly credible, that she's finished her book, she doesn't need the documents anymore, and she's happy to transfer them to me because I'm helping Michael Riconosciuto for all these years. And because they legally belong to Michael, that's her words, and we know that. She knows that. She said she can't transfer them to me unless Michael or his attorney instruct her that it's okay to do it. So within 24 hours, Michael sends a letter. He sends it through Bill Hamilton because he has the approval for all written correspondence with him. Bill scans it and sends it straight back to me, and I give it in an email straight back to Cherie Seymour. She's shocked. It says categorically from Michael to Bill, I've heard Cherie Seymour has offered to provide to Peter Osborne the documents of all of the documents of my material. I have no problem with this. Please notify my attorney, George Ramby, when Peter has actual possession of the documents. I have all my communications with her, offering to immediately pay the courier costs for it to come to Australia by PayPal. Then I'm shocked. She reneges. She then starts putting Chris Milligan into the loop. She tells me that they're now doing a film. They're producing a film. And that Chris Milligan is reluctant to release the original documents in case there's any litigation resulting from the film. That he's prepared to have the documents transferred to his accommodation and that I can arrange to make a copy. I categorically put in writing, we're not interested in copies. You're to send them to me, the originals, and you're not permitted to make any copies for any other third parties. All communication stops. We did not know that Christian Hansen and Zachary were going across to make all the copies of the documents and working with Cherie Seymour to produce this film, the series. I will release next episode the recorded interviews with the wife of Michael Riconosciuto, the correspondence and communications with Lou Barfardi and also with Michael, and confirm that even the Amazon website confirms that Michael's cousin had met with Chris Milligan and advised him that her book, The Octopus, is based upon stolen documents. I wonder if the attorneys of Netflix are fully aware of the legality of producing a TV series and based on stolen documents that belong to Michael Riconosciuto, and to slander and defame him as if he has no legal rights. He has all legal rights, and those documents were instructed to be sent to me because I'm trying to get him out of prison. Next podcast, I will play the recorded podcast, Chris Milligan, the publisher, interviewing as if independent Cherie Seymour, Christian Hansen and Zachary, all praising each other about how wonderful their collaboration has been. It's based upon the book, her book, and the copying of all the documents, and how it's a tribute and a credit to Danny Casolaro. Well, I think the public, when seeing the evidence they left out and the way that they have behaved ethically, and to slander the sources, Michael Riconosciuto and Bill Hamilton, and throw them under a bus with Danny, may think differently. As I said, I'd love to sit down with the attorneys of Netflix because it was quite clear in the communications that Cherie Seymour and Chris Milligan had with me in 2016 is they realised they had a litigation problem in relation to the production of the documentary series with Christian Hansen and Zachary Treats back in 2016. And of course now I'm going to play for you the experts as the point sources and then being questioned on C-SPAN. As far as Netflix viewership, how's it been doing? And at what point, Zachary Treats, did you search for financing for this? When we pitched it to our producers in 2018 and 19, when they're soliciting all my evidence, they were the first people that just seemed to grasp exactly what we were doing. So they helped us develop a pitch and we pitched it to Netflix. It was the only pitch we did. And then the host says, you mentioned former MSNBC producer Anne Klink. Who else should we know about who helped you along the path? Well, let's listen to them being asked those questions.
Christian Hansen, are you still investigating?
Yes. I mean, you see when we pull out and show this larger map of connections, we have it structured with tentacles, and basically to me, all of those tentacles are great films, great stories, and then people also, since the show's come out, that, kind of had fascinating firsthand experiences with different aspects of both the story we present and the parts of the larger story, and news stories have come forward and messaged me, on Twitter and Instagram, and if they found my email. So I simple answer, yes, but I'm also taking a little break. But yeah, I can't wait to get back into it full time again.
And there is an online community now regarding the octopus murders, talking about Danny Casolaro and some of the people that you feature in this, aren't there? Do you ever check those out?
I don't. I mean, I think Reddit is probably the place that's really happening. But I don't know. I've just been lost in my own research, and I've tapped into those communities, but they're mostly discussing materials that I put on the internet in 2015. I put a lot of material, me and another researcher named Emma Best put a trove of work. I gave it to Emma, and she put it on archive.org, and there's just thousands of pages concerning the Casolaro case and the Inslaw case, and some of the other cases on there. So I'm familiar with the material that they have that they're discussing, and then I've got stuff that they don't have. So I don't know. I haven't really tapped in, but I should. And Zach, are you checking in with the internet at Casolaro Inslaw community?
Not really. It's just a matter of sort of time, I think. But I think it is interesting that people, even before the show came out, people would be discussing the case or find out Christian's name, and be looking at Danny's files and not realizing that the reason that they have Danny's files was because Christian had gone to Missouri and gotten his files, and they were on archive.org. And so Christian in some ways is like the early Johnny Appleseed of the Danny Casolaro story with the internet, taking it all the way back to 2015.
Well, I apologize to the audience if we've confused you at all in the last hour. If you want to watch the full series, it's The Octopus Murders, 4 parts. It's on Netflix. Christian Hansen and Zachary Treats have been our guests, and they are the producers. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you so much.
So now that we discover that Anne Klink is assisting Christian Hansen and Zachary to produce this Netflix series called American Conspiracy that somehow comes to the conclusion that Danny Casolaro was depressed, that he committed suicide, and he was led astray by Michael Riconosciuto, who Anne Klink describes as a creep, and Bill Hamilton, who is delusional that he's getting all his intelligence on Promis being installed on Trident nuclear submarines from a crazy woman at a bowling alley getting notes when they know that's not true. Christian Hansen and Zachary know that I uncovered all the evidence of the contracts with Johns Hopkins Applied Physics, Hadron Inc., Radcore Inc., who were my partners, by the way, John Hopkins, and also Bill's partners for his ventures with Enslow and my ventures for encryption in Australia. And Computer Power Group with artificial intelligence. And more importantly, there's a copy of my passport, Australian passport, registered at the security of the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, which is the official research laboratory for NSA, CIA, FBI, DIA, 3 months before 9/11. And that's when they arranged for me to meet the architect of Echelon and NSA's top expert on encryption. See, Zachary and Christian both know the true story that I tell in my podcasts relating to CIA Operation Stillpoint and the Promis software. And the first application was for tracking Trident nuclear submarines to track Soviet nuclear submarines, and the second application was put into Swift banking at Citibank. But the major concern I have is I would never have cooperated with them because we have interviews with key witnesses and best friends of Danny Casolaro that categorically say that Anne Klink is not telling the truth. Danny Casolaro did not trust her. He would have never have asked her to take the documents from his house. In fact, he was giving them to other people in case something happened to him when he was going down to Martinsburg, copies of certain documents. And what's amazing is this. Now, I have launched several federal parliamentary inquiries to expose corruption, threats against me as a witness by a company that sold the Promis software to Australia, and tax fraud worth billions of dollars. Also involving the worst culprit is the company selling the Promis software to the Australian government. And we know when you're doing in real inquiries of government, you cannot have anyone involved who has potential conflicts of interest. And so when we go through the Martinsburg police report, the FBI investigations into the evidence of BCCI and Enslow Inc., the Department of Justice, we find that Anne Klink is boasting that she's in all of these investigations, that she's got 5 boxes of material she took from Danny's house. This is verified by John C. Dwyer, the Deputy Associate Attorney General in President Clinton's administration. Klink says she will give us copies of Casolaro's notes in Dwyer's handwriting Dwyer had served as senior advisor to Attorney General Janet Reno on a wide range of civil and criminal enforcement issues, acted as primary liaison with White House counsel's office. Dwyer further notes, and Klink attended a meeting at the White House with Tony Casolaro and Webster Hubbell. He describes Klink as a journalist and friend of the Casolaro family. Well, I have a problem with that. See, when I gave my evidence confidentially to Tony, he gave it to Anne Klink. And Anne Klink and Tony completely shut down. So they both have the evidence that I was offering to help the Martinsburg police open up a homicide investigation. Now, given that they're the best friends, I thought they would help me because that's what FBI agent Thomas Gates advised me, but that's not what happened. So here she is helping with an investigation, a production of a thing that comes to a conclusion that Danny was led astray, that Michael Riconosciuto is a creep, Bill Hamilton is delusional and got Danny killed, yet she's holding all the evidence relating to the BCCI checks, financed by the Kuwait royal family that Danny had, and is the key evidence that Senator Kerry's demanding that Robert Altman hands across the Monte Carlo accounts, the BCCI transactions with Adnan Khashoggi for the TOW missiles. There's a problem there. That's called a serious conflict of interest because it also includes the evidence of the Promis software being stolen by Dr. Earl Bryan, her boss, and the companies, United Press International, Financial News and Info Technology, who she works for. This is really disturbing. See, at the time that Danny's found dead, UPI is facing bankruptcy. Also, don't forget, Dr. Earl Bryan is charged with fraud during this time as well. And the owners of Financial News Network and United Press International, who Anne Klink works for, is Info Technology Inc. And what's amazing about this conflict of interest is Christian Hansen and Zachary and Anne Klink know that I had all the evidence that proved that Earl Bryan was involved with the Promis software and contracts with CIA, with Rupert Murdoch's company, who were the partners of Insular Inc. Isn't that really interesting? That the person taking the documents is Anne Klink, and she introduced Danny Casolaro to meet with her boss, Earl Bryan. And he's confronting Earl Bryan with all the evidence he's got on the Iran-Contra arms and drugs involving bank transactions with Richard Secord in the Cayman Islands and also in Switzerland. Also, he's got the BCCI checks. And the BCCI investigators are indicting all the directors of BCCI, First American Bank shares. And Earl Bryan's also facing fraud charges and bankruptcy. It's a pretty unsettling time. But what I also have is the evidence of veteran investigator Richard Fricker, whose source is someone inside the CIA. And I have my recorded interviews with him that he was given the address where the proof and legal proof of the Promis software stolen by her boss Earl Bryan was installed into all the banks and the financial centres in London. And I have my recorded interviews with veteran investigator Robert Parry before he died, and with Richard Fricker, who are praising my ability to uncover the legal evidence. And it's definitive that Dr. Earl Bryan was involved in the theft of the Promis software with CIA and was contracted to CIA to do this. And that's Michael's testimony independently in the court that I have verified, and I worked for the companies that did it. So we have a problem. Anne Klink is coordinating this whole production that is steering it in the direction away from where the evidence is, given that she's holding all the evidence that seems to have not been given to Senator Kerry and Jack Blum for the prosecution and indictment of all the people behind the BCCI checks and money laundering of drugs and arms through Florida, and also the Promis software involving her boss. And there's the proof, is that I have all the documents. It's in the podcasts that were being reviewed by Christian Hansen and Zachary. They had to register. They had to get on to look at my evidence. But more important, they knew, because they'd been communicating with me for quite a few years. And I told them in my correspondence. And so I have all the records of CIA, all the contracts with Earl Bryan's companies, all the contracts with Wang Labs, and all the R&D directors flying across to work with Computer Power Group, who is Inslaw's partner for the Promis software, and the common director on Hadron Inc., common investor behind Hadron Inc., and on the board of News Limited is Stanley Schumann, the managing director of Allen and Company. And I have all that evidence, definitive evidence. And so we go on from there. Then they're doing the circuits as the experts, Zachary and Christian. They're the go-to points now on everything you need to know about Promis software, the death of Danny Casolaro, Wackenhut. Their knowledge is unlimited as the point sources now. And in the middle of an interview, they're confronted by Danny Jones. He pulls up my articles that have been written on Covert Action magazine in 2023, before they release the Netflix series. And also just after the Netflix series. And it's saying every footnote on this article goes back to Peter Osborne guy, Zachary Tritz. Yes, he's in Australia. It's hard to divine what's in Peter Osborne's mind and why he thinks that's in the article, which I have to be honest, I haven't fully read, but the things that we have discussed, it's hard to argue with things that are simply just not true. I do not even know how to respond to this article. Then Danny Jones says he has spent probably the most time investigating this case. He spent 30 years on this case. Christian Hansen, I gave him a lot of material in 2016. Well, yes, Christian, you did photocopy or take photographs of some documents, but that's when you wanted to be part of our real investigation that had been in full swing 10 years before you came along. In fact, 16 years before you came along. And if I put documents through a photocopier, it doesn't turn the photocopier into a credible investigative journalist or analyst. You have no idea what's in Danny's notes. You have no idea what has been in my records for 24 years. You have no idea of the line-by-line statements in thousands of pages of sworn testimony that Michael Riconosciuto provided. That's true. You have no idea of the thousands of documents that I have from CIA and other credible sources that validate all of the court cases and transactions and affidavits of credible people given to Bill Hamilton. And you prove your ignorance when asked about that. This guy from Australia, who I have only spoken on the phone a few times, my goodness, it's a very uncomfortable interview for Christian Hansen. He's kind of the expert on the case. Well, that's kind of you to say that. I copied the notes. What took you so long, dude? As I said, a photocopier I don't think. I'm in Australia, but I know what is really the Promis software and what really the evidence that Danny Casolaro was investigating, because I got that also from Michael and Ray Levass, who met with Danny Casolaro, and several other witnesses who were providing me with information that they knew that Danny Casolaro was investigating directly from the source. Then he says he was working with this Canadian guy, Gordon Savell. I mean, for goodness sake, a Canadian guy. He's a veteran investigative journalist and film producer. You guys have never done an investigation before. You've never made a non-documentary film. You've never done a research paper that's been independently validated to show your credentials. And he says, we collaborated for a few years, exchanged a few emails. And what reason it ended, I'm not quite sure what happened. Well, let's go off, and in a minute we'll have a look at that, but look at this last bit, demonstrating your ignorance. Christian Hansen says, look, 2 paragraphs above, it says Robert Altman had reluctantly agreed to meet with Danny Casolaro, who was threatening to give the BCCI checks by the Kuwait royal family to purchase the TOW missiles to a Senate investigation led by Senator Kerry, along with 2 folders of documents involving Pentagon fraud involving Hughes aircraft. Where did they learn that information? That's based on what? You can quote a monkey. Well, let's listen to that, because the evidence is in the podcast and all the documents that I gave you. More importantly, it is the evidence in Danny Casolaro's folders that you copied and that Anne Klink's holding. And it is in the affidavits of witnesses who met with Danny Casolaro on that day. But more importantly, it is the evidence that shows the motive to have Danny Casolaro killed. So let's listen to that interview so that the public can see when you're confronted about who is Peter Osborne.
Makes allegations about us being CIA
mouthpieces.
It's like, I don't know. How do you even respond to that? It's like, how do you?
Yeah, pull up the conclusion of the article that we were looking at. The conclusion of that was fantastic. Yeah, basically that article basically concludes that you guys are peddling the CIA narrative of conspiracy theories by labeling the show conspiracy, American Conspiracy.
There it is.
What was the end of it? Yeah, that go back to the very bottom.
Oh shit!
There's
I blew it up in a.
There's me in a picture where I'm.
Where'd it go?
I think it's the very last. Oh, yeah.
I blew it up.
There it is. American Conspiracy. The Octopus Murders effectively serves as the agenda of the CIA and continuing a cover-up.
I guess I almost said as much.
Massive crimes surrounding the theft of the Promis software and trying to discourage further investigation into the crimes of the Octopus.
I don't understand how anybody can draw that conclusion from. I mean, I said earlier, I guess, that we effectively serve the agenda of the CIA by saying that whatever makes the CIA seem badass helps their thing, but we don't help their cover up, nor do we help. I don't know. It's like, how do you respond
look
to
at this 2 paragraphs above saying Robert Altman, not one of my favorite directors of cinema, but Robert A. Altman, who is worked at this bank BCCI. A lot of people have seen Robert Altman on our star map, and they think that's some sort of. We're talking about a different Robert Altman. Right. We love Nashville. Okay, so Robert A. Altman had reluctantly agreed to meet Casolaro, who was threatening to give the checks from the Kuwait royal family to purchase TOW missiles. Okay. This is saying that this guy that worked at actually its First American Bank, not BCCI, was reluctantly agreed to. Where did they learn that information? That's based on what?
Well, I mean, click the link.
Let's click the link. Let's see
link.
where we learn about how he reluctantly agreed to meet Gessler.
This article's full of conjecture.
Okay, so it's going to go to another article on the same
on the
exact
same-
website.
yeah.
It's SEO, man. That's how you that's how you climb the search engines. Go to it. Can you go to the other article?
It wouldn't load, so I don't know if it's broken.
There it is.
There
It
we
works.
go.
So I don't know. So
It's then a self-reinforcing thing.
Yeah.
I haven't even looked at this, but I'm just assuming that it's probably going to be
by the same the same journalist.
Same author, yeah.
And so it's going to be circular. It's what's called a tautology, right? A circular argument. And so it's like, I don't even know how to respond to something like this because there's no way to prove it, like a negative of this. It's like, I don't know, dude. Like, do we help the cover up? I don't think so. Do we bring new information to light that whoever wrote this had never known before? Absolutely. It's like, what's your point? Like, we're discouraging research? Like, in what universe are we discourage more research?
I think this article also says that the meeting that we had in Conway, South Carolina, it quotes someone saying that meeting was staged in the film.
Oh,
And it's just like
interviewed the lady,
it quotes
right?
a guy from Australia who like I've talked to on the phone a few times, but like never about that. And okay, so why don't you can quote like a monkey, about something. I mean, how do you?
What's your evidence?
I sound like a monkey. No, why does he know? They also didn't ask us for comment. So how is that fair journalism?
I knew if we like started going into this, I was going to start getting like so heated and so annoyed. But it's just so annoying.
Every footnote of this article goes back to this Peter Osborne guy.
Right, he's in Australia.
Oh, that's the Australian guy.
Yeah,
Okay.
I think that's a picture of him.
There he is.
I don't know. It's hard for us to divine what's in Peter Osborne's mind and why he thinks that what he thinks in this article, which I have to be honest, I just haven't actually fully read. But the things that we've discussed, like they're just not true. It's hard to argue with things that are just simply not true.
And we also like
But he was one of the guys who spent the most time investigating this case, right? He spent is it 30 years or something?
I gave him a lot of material in
really?
in 2016.
Of Danny's notes.
He's like the expert on the case, but he was like, you've done a great thing by going to the archive that had all of Danny's notes and copying them. It's like, well, what took you so long, dude? Like, it's like the first thing I did. You try to just learn about the investigative Gessler case. The first thing you do is like go to the archive and get his notes and read those, right?
Mm-hmm. How much collaboration did you guys have on the research? Or like even in your early days? Like I'm sure you learned about him.
In the early days, there was like an email chain where this guy, Gordon Savell, and his partner at the time, Peter, who they've since had a falling out, and then Bill Hamilton, and then this other like pretty awesome kind of FOIA expert named Emma Best. We all just kind of like exchanged information over email for a few years, and then it got a little kooky, and Emma left and I left, or whatever. It died down or whatever. I'm not sure exactly what happened. But it was mostly Emma's FOIAs and the documents that I got, stateside. Because the other guys one guy was in Australia and the other guy was in Canada, and they didn't come here, and all the files were here.
Right.
But we gave them, all the stuff, and we put it on archive.org.
What happened really was that Christian had gone to, and we show it in the movie, Christian had gone to the Missouri archive, captured pictures of all of Danny's notes, and then gave them to Emma, who then, I think without Christian's permission, but it wasn't a big deal, I guess, but put those all on archive.org. And that's years and years ago. And you can go to archive.org. I think it's funny, like anybody who knew about this case before we released this documentary, a lot of them would have seen documents of Danny's notes on archive.org, I think, and doesn't realize like they actually kind of come from Christian doing the work.
And Emma, it was me.
And Emma posting them. And you see his name, like she put his name.
She put my Twitter handle under all the stuff that I contributed.
Yeah.
Oh, it was nice.
Well, when it comes to credibility, integrity, and telling the truth, it looked pretty uncomfortable for Christian Hansen and Zachary just to answer simple questions. Did they know Peter Osborne? And yes, has no idea where that evidence came from. Well, let's have a look at what Peter Osborne gave them when they solicited the evidence to do the production. In 2018, both William Hamilton and myself provided Christian Hansen and Zachary Treats with the legal proof the Martinsburg police had a witness who had seen a man similar in appearance to former CIA agent Joseph Queller entering and leaving Danny Casolaro's hotel room on the day he was found dead. They selectively included only part of the information, thus deceiving and misrepresenting the facts to the public audience. Let's have a look at what they were given and what they withheld from the public. Well, in my emails to them, I have all forensic evidence and telephone calls recorded with them. I provided them with copies of the Business Risk International. Now, we had this back in 2004 when we filed our access for information request to the Martinsburg police. This is a copy of the letter from Business, and it's in my podcast number 1, that Christian Hansen, Zachary Treats downloaded and listened to all my evidence and the recorded interviews that I had with key witnesses. And it says categorically that Joseph Queller was employed by Business Risk International. Don Walker is the director. It talks about the investigation of the Promis software. It talks about the fact that Joseph Queller is a former CIA agent and also works with US Army Intelligence Special Forces. It also confirms that Business Risk International previously was contracted by Inslaw to investigate the theft of the Inslaw's Promis software, particularly evidence that Peter Wiedniks had delivered the tapes to Michael Riconosciuto and that had been stolen by Earl Bryan. In fact, they're wanting to be paid $279,000 for the services rendered that hadn't been paid. So here we have Joseph Queller on the scene, putting down his business card, Business Risk International, in front of Danny Casolaro, witnessed by Lynn Knoll, to introduce himself, coming back from Operation Desert Storm, by chance bumping into Danny Casolaro. And he somehow is connected to Promis software, Inslaw Inc., and personally knows Peter Wiedniks. Isn't that really an amazing coincidence? But you had this, Christian and Zachary. And we also gave you, and I sent it to you because I got my records. In 1994, Bill Hamilton's attorneys, Charles Work plus witnesses, had met with FBI agent Scott Erskine, who had told them that Martinsburg police were holding a witness statement, a witness who had seen someone similar in appearance to Joseph Queller entering Danny's room and leaving the room on the day that he's found dead, that he's not alone, and that this person has a key. Now, we had that, plus the Business Risk International letter, plus interviewed all the witnesses, years before Christian Hansen comes to see us. And that's why we filed the original access for information request to the Martinsburg police in 2004. And we were denied, telling us that it's sealed. And not only that, it's talking about the fact that it involves George Pender Earl Bryan, Peter Wiedniks, the Promis software, and other witnesses, Charles Hayes, who had been fearful that Danny was going to be visiting an appropriate building at Jackson Place, just outside of White House. And my podcast shows what the building was and what its importance was, given that it was being used by Vice President George Bush Sr. as the task force for the war on drugs and terrorism being set up with CIA, which was using the Promis software. And in addition to that, the letter quite clearly shows the concerns of the attorneys representing Inslaw Inc. that there seems to be conflicts of interest with Stephen Zipperstein. They need assurances that he's not in communications with Laurel Jensen and Stephen Trott, particularly with the links with Earl Bryan and Financial News Network, who Anne Klink works for. Isn't that really amazing that we've got an FBI special agent, Erskine? He's telling them that Martinsburg Police has a witness statement identifying someone in appearance to Joseph Queller, former CIA agent, military intelligence, returning from Desert Storm, seen meeting with Danny Casolaro, and also seen entering and leaving with a key on the very day that Danny Casolaro is found dead. So Christian had this, Zachary had it. So our credible investigations were recorded in our manuscript of our book. And in 2019 and 20, Zachary Treats and Christian Hansen met with my colleague, co-author Gordon Savell, promising him that they want to reveal the truth, and they're requesting a copy of our manuscript with all our analysis and detailed research investigation summaries, including all our interviews with all key witnesses. And so Zachary Treats asks if he can put a USB key into Gordon Savell's computer and take a copy of it, which he does. And that also belongs to me, my intellectual property. And right now, we're in the processes. This is June 2024. We've been asking for over a month and a half for them to return that USB key with our manuscripts and intellectual property and evidence, because Christian Hansen's now boasting on all of the circuits of his interviews that he's going to be writing a book. He's going to finish the book that Danny Casolaro was going to write. And we feel that given that we were deceived into providing all our evidence that didn't appear on the Netflix, given they promised they were going to tell the truth, we've been asking for it back. And we're still waiting for it to be returned, because it's inappropriate that they're using all of our research, our intellectual property, and the documents belonging to Michael Riconosciuto that were meant to be sent to me in Australia for protection for Michael to help him get him out of prison. We needed the original documents. That they believe that they can go off and do more TV series and write a book. Well, let's have a look at what they withheld. There's the evidence, and this is the amazing thing. Our application was denied. We were told it was sealed. I've been writing in 2019 offering to help them to open a homicide investigation, given all my new evidence of recorded witnesses willing to testify in court, that he wasn't depressed. He actually picked up 5 boxes of documents from the Martinsburg Police, IRS computer center, and it was in his car. And all of those documents in his car are missing. His briefcase is missing with all his documents that Olga said, a big wad of paper and documents he took with him, plus 2 more folders that were sealed given by William Turner. Commits suicide, no briefcase, no documents in 2 sealed folders, and no 5 boxes of documents are in his car. They're all gone. He's just committed suicide. Can't explain where that's gone. Well, this is sealed. Well, when I saw that it was handed over willingly by the Martinsburg police to Christian Hansen to film with the shock horror he discovers after slandering Bill Hamilton, question his credibility, slandering Michael, questioning his credibility. He's in shock horror for the public that there's a sketch. There's a sketch, an ID sketch of a witness that's seen someone that looks like Joe Sequela presented at the end. And yet we know that he got access to the documents earlier whilst doing the production. So let's have a look. When I wrote to the Martinsburg police complaining that they willingly handed across to a conspiracy program live on TV and reject my genuine offer to help open a homicide, when was it unsealed? So can you tell me the exact dates when it was officially sealed and then unsealed? And then they admit it wasn't sealed. So we had been denied for 20 years. There was no record of any request to have them sealed. And that I'm welcome to resubmit a new Freedom of Information Access, which we do. So Gordon immediately files a new one and we have everything. And look what we found. Here is the sketch on the left of a witness seeing a man meeting with Danny Keselar on the Thursday night. And it definitely looks like our friend Joe Sequela. That was always in the Martinsburg police evidence. It was never reported in the Martinsburg police official report. It was never reported by the FBI investigation into evidence that Danny Keselar had evidence of BCCI, checks, transactions with Monte Carlo. It was never included into the official Zippersine independent report developed with Anne Klink. It was withheld, despite Bill Hamilton's attorneys in 1994 asking serious questions, what are they going to do about this? And Christian Hansen knew that before he started his investigation and production of the Netflix series. It was withheld, all my evidence that I provided to him all that time. Here is the letters, handwritten letters by the witness who's passed away, witnessing, seeing a man entering Danny Keselaro's room with a key around about 9 and 9:30 p.m. on the Friday evening, describing him that it's not Danny Keselaro. And the reason why this witness came through is after seeing the picture of Danny Keselaro for the first time on the news, she realized that the man that she saw entering the room with the key was not Danny Keselaro. He had dark hair and basically it wasn't Danny, but he was entering with a key and also carrying a paper bag. And there it is. Also saw the same person come back at 12:30 a.m. on the Saturday morning, the day that he's found dead. A sketch and a letter. None of this evidence was put into the official Martinsburg police report. It was withheld. None of this report was put into FBI investigation of Danny Keselaro investigating the BCCI evidence, the checks, the payments for the tow missiles, and the Inslaw investigation of the same, or the Department of Justice report. despite the request being made in 1994 by Bill Hamilton's attorneys. And there you can see it. They witnessed it. They saw the same gentleman again. I've put out the second person's name just to redact it there, and then this is in the official report as well. It's a letter. Dear Chief, Joe didn't commit suicide. Respectfully request you reopen the case and commence a homicide investigation. This is dated on August 17. Joe sent me various photos and photocopy of his manuscript on his work and the allegations of Justice Department which stole the software from Inslaw Inc. The manuscript spells out who is involved in his allegations, and if you do not reopen the case, I will be forced to send photocopies to the New York Times and Washington Post. Pardon me. Joe thought this may happen. That is why he sent copies to me and one other person. Now, isn't this interesting? I'm not sure that this is Anne Klink. I believe it's another witness who was causing hell for the police, believing that Danny Casolaro had been murdered. I will wait to read in the papers if you reopen the case. Should I not hear anything, you can inform proper people that myself and my other friend will be releasing all documents, photos, manuscripts, and 2 tape recordings made by Joe. I have interviewed this person, and they confirmed that they gave the photos, the manuscript, and the 2 tape recordings to Christian Hansen for the Netflix series, including a hat that was given as a gift for him to wear while impersonating Danny Casolaro. And then this, the real smoking gun. This is a 1-page summary of the importance of the BCCI checks, the 1 million and 4 million check, financed by the Kuwait royal family, originally proposed to be financed by Tiny Roland. Now, why is this important to me? Because the evidence that Danny Casolaro was investigating included BCCI, Ted Shackley, and Michael Ledeen, Richard Secord, Oliver North, Robert Sensi, but also the transactions of the Iran-Contra arms and payments with Tiny Roland's company, Lonrho, which includes evidence in Australia that was before one of our royal commissions and investigations of Alan Bond, who received the $6 million check transferred across from Earl Bryan for payment for the Iran-Contra arms going through the ports of Australia. Tiny Roland, Adnan Khashoggi, Kinney Mini Services of London. These are the transactions that we're talking about for the arms deal that CIA, Dwayne Claridge, Oliver North, Richard Secord had lied about knowledge of this, and you'll see why that's important. The day, 4 days before Danny dies. It says here the sales originated with North and Casey. The weapons came from storage in the United States, England. Banking was done through Monte Carlo and Switzerland, which is the BCCI branch. I can guarantee that no one has even a remote idea of the banks or the bank accounts involved. Further, no one has ever tied Roland's to the money in Iran-Contra. These sales involved 10,000 TOW missiles, national stock numbers, all-purpose missile launchers, national stock numbers, Hawk electronics guided missile intercept system parts, national stock numbers, foreign sales numbers, stock market numbers, from the United Kingdom and United States to Iran. The money was handled in paying commissions as follows. I have copies of 2 checks, one for 1 million and one for 4 million, made out by Manichuk Gorbanafar, to Adnan Khashoggi in 3 million checks to an account in Monte Carlo. They show payments through Gorbanafar and Khashoggi, Tiny Rollins in London, and David Kimke. Mossad of Israel funneled the money for North and Company into Khashoggi's account. The funds went through the Cayman Islands. The banks I can document as being involved are BCI, Bank of Credit and Commerce International, 33 Boulevard, Princess Charlotte, Monte Carlo. Check number presented for payment 14 February 1986, drawn by manager Gorbachev, Credit Suisse for $3 million. Bank of Credit and Commerce International, same address, checks numbered accordingly, presented payment 14th of February 1986 by manager Gorbachev on Credit Suisse for $3 million each. Bank of Credit, Commerce International, same address, check number, presented 14 February 1986, Gorbachev, Credit Suisse, sum of $3 million. Don't you just love this? It's in the official evidence files. What date was it received? Who gave it? The fact that it's in there is linked to the evidence that Anne Klink had taken from the house, which is the copies of the BCCI checks. This is overwhelming evidence. And why was that important? Because the first podcast I did categorically shows that Senator Kerry was demanding that Robert Altman, as the attorney with power of attorney for Faisal Faluj, the secret owner of First American Bank shares, was being demanded to hand across these checks and the Monte Carlo accounts, which he refused to do. The evidence that I put up and provided them confirmed that this was the smoking gun that got Danny Casolaro killed. The fact that it was covered up. In addition, in the records we found, on this date, 16th of August 91, an unknown female caller advised this officer that the reporter killed at the Sheraton Inn was killed by his contact. The caller also advised that the two had lunch together at the seafood restaurant. The call came in on the following line. This is in the official evidence folder. We were blocked for 20 years and they handed this all across to Christian Hansen whilst he's producing and doing the research for the investigation. He never showed this. And what surprises us even more, there's no copy of our original application for freedom of information. There's no copy of my multiple correspondence backwards and forwards with General Swartwood and his attorney right up to 2020 and 2024. But there is a copy of Christian Hansen's application for his freedom of information access. What the hell is it doing in the evidence box? But as you can see, he learnt that we had made our application, and in 2014 he's filing his. He also promised me that he would drive Trey Casolaro across to pick up the evidence in order for us to open a homicide investigation. I didn't see anything in there in the Netflix series or any evidence at all other than him impersonating Trey's father, acting classes to look like him, grow his hair, and selfies, going through a meltdown, being misled and led astray on a conspiracy. There's no evidence that he helped Trey or me at all. And that was what upset me the most, that it's in the evidence box when they hand it across to him to continue with the conspiracy theory. This is when I first met him, and I'm just going to repeat it. I know how William Hamilton, Michael Riconosciuto, Gordon Savell and myself are directly involved in the investigation of the Promis software story. This is dated 2014. Why are you interested in this story, given you were not even born during these major events that Danny Casolaro was investigating? And his response, I'm interested in researching Wackenhut. I recently booked myself into room 517 at the Sheraton Hotel in Martinsburg, West Virginia, where Danny Casolaro died. I stayed in the room for the entire night, and I feel that I have some kind of connection with Danny Casolaro. I just thought to myself, this is really creepy. And I can still say today, after you watch that Netflix series where he says there's no evidence, he's seen nothing, he had full access to the evidence box. We knew what was in it. We were blocked. He gets it, and he does a disservice to the public. He could have presented the evidence that we told him was in there. We knew was in there. And he still has no direct knowledge or understanding of what CIA NSA Echelon Network is, and he has no understanding of what modifications Michael Riconosciuto made to the Promis software and the applications where it's been used. But he took our manuscript and has refused to give it back still. We're still waiting for it. He got the evidence in advance. He pretended he was shocked. So let's now look at what he knows that I told him. In the year 2000, I was approached by a journalist, a credible investigative journalist, a veteran, who was exposing Wackenhut and the Promis software. And he was impressed at how I had got up 2 parliamentary inquiries, particularly the Standing Committee of Privileges investigating the threats made against me by a company owned by Rupert Murdoch that sold the Promis software to the Australian government. And he asked if I could have a look at a story called Wackenhut and Promis, and this is the year 2000. And I did a full technical analysis on it and then came to the conclusion and said, wait a minute, the only company that can really do this is Rupert Murdoch's company, the one that's threatening me, has been threatening me since 1995. So I pick up the telephone in January 2001 and I introduced myself to Bill Hamilton for the first time. I asked him, do you know an Australian company called Computer Power Group? Bill's in shock. No one's ever asked me that, he says. Yes. In 1982, I was approached by Roger Allen and Ted Prince at a hotel in Boston, and they wanted to be appointed as the distributor of Inslaw's Promis software for the markets of Australia and Asia. They abandoned Inslaw Inc. in 1984, claiming they were never able to sell a copy of the Promis software in Australia or Asia. My next question is, did you know that Rupert Murdoch owns the Computer Power Group? Bill says, no, I did not know Rupert Murdoch owned the company. And then my journey starts. I'm in the middle of a privileges committee that's investigating the threats made against me to destroy my career as a trusted advisor in science technology and medical technologies and applications and encryption, and the bogus prince that came and destroyed us, who works for CIA. And I said to them during the investigation, this does not make any sense. The only way they, being Murdoch's company, can be permitted to destroy my career with governments and my encryption company, having served as a trusted government advisor and get away with this, is that Computer Power Group is working for intelligence. And after 21 years at that time, when they were approaching me, to see if I can provide the evidence for Netflix. I didn't know it was Netflix. I just thought it was a credible TV program. I now understand that the Promis software affair and the involvement of intelligence in Australia was correct. But what I did also in January 2001 is that I sent an email to the United Nations Office of International Investigations Oversight Committee confirming that I am currently a witness before the Australian Federal Parliamentary Standing Committee of Privileges investigating the threats that were made against me involving a company owned by Rupert Murdoch. And I confirmed that I'd uncovered legal evidence that Prince Haji van Aldig was working with CIA agents in 1997 in the Philippines prior to his visit to Australia to make the $1 billion donation on TV to the United Nations SEAL program. The legal evidence also confirms they were money laundering gold bullion for Ferdinand and Imelda Marcos through Citibank, Bankers Trust, and the European Union Bank in Antigua. And my evidence shows that it was using the Promis software. So the legal evidence that I held confirmed that the bogus prince was working with the director of operations of CIA, and that director was reporting to the CIA director, had set up a series of teams seeking investment opportunities worldwide, working on commission basis pursuant to their CIA assignments. The director of operations also widely distributes his resume stating that he worked for intelligence services and now purchases gold for the US government, uses offshore entities for high yield investment programs and financial opportunities, and advised clients that he is the manager of over $335 billion of private and government funds. He also advised clients that he attends G7 and G9 governmental meetings as one of the main presidential advisors, and he worked for the CIA, the company. He told his investors that his boss was George Tenet, the CIA director. And that's when Christian Hansen, I believe, is 11 years of age. I think starting secondary school. There's a picture of live on TV of the Promis, the prince storm over Sabah with his passport, making the donation live on TV, being interviewed, confirming that he works for President Ferdinand Marcos. And what was amazing is Danny Casolaro wanted to come to Australia to investigate the Promis software. He wanted to investigate the money laundering of drugs and arms with Wackenhut, Cabazon, Casino, across with Nugenhan Bank and the Mafia, with Robert Booth Nichols. And it turns out that the person behind the Prince is Jeff Moss, who's the brother of Peter Moss, the merchant banker, representing the Bank of South Pacific Island, owned by Prince Haji, that destroyed our credible encryption and trade program and healthcare program with all countries worldwide in 1997 and 1998. And it turns out that he was a witness to the Costigan Royal Commission back in the 80s. Pardon me. That is the official statements about the GIF Foundation. My companies had signed all the agreements with the GIF Foundation that's working with the Prince, and when he comes in and destroys us with the report. And as you can see, it's the SEAL program. So when Christian Hansen is 11, my testimony, my evidence, was not in communications with Bill Hamilton or Michael Riconosciuto. It was my testimony. And I've been able to validate Michael's testimony in court is true about the activities that he was doing, and Bill's testimony is true. And when I communicated with Michael, and with Gordon, he sent us letters, and he was telling me more about the technical modifications. But the first application, he said the client was NATO and the US Navy for the modified Promis software for tracking Soviet nuclear submarines. It was integrated into the missile fire control and command systems of the US Trident submarines using the VAX 11 780 computers for the main systems offshore. And also, he told me all of the smaller versions of the computer systems that they were using on the submarines. He then told me that the second application was modified Promis software was for Swift banking. It was installed at Transaction Technologies Inc., a subsidiary of Citibank, for Dr. Earl Bryan, chairman of Hadron Inc. and CIA, to move their covert funds through the international automatic clearing houses. I have all that evidence of trillions of dollars of gold bullion going through Citibank, Bankers Trust, and Deutsche Bank, and it involves A.B. Krongard, the director of Johns Hopkins Medicine and executive director of CIA, on the TV programs that Christian Hansen and Zachary watched, and I have their correspondence confirming they watched it. In addition to that, Michael testified in court that the software, the modified software, was renamed the Lean software, and it was sold to the Australian government. Now, that's in the court testimony. No one in jury will understand that. The CIA's Promis was also designed to run on the architecture of the Intergraph VAX computers. And here's a note. Only the author, myself, knew the Lean software was sold to the Australian Federal Attorney General, ASIO, AFP and Austrac by Rupert Murdoch's company called Computer Power Group, because I work for them. I've got their resumes. I've got all of their annual reports. So Michael's testimony in court is validated independently by me when I picked the phone up to speak to Bill Hamilton in January 2001, and Michael only starts communicating with me in 2004, and it was all in his transcripts of his court testimony in 1991 and 1992. In addition to that, given the damaging evidence that I have, and I'm having a federal police investigation of fraud against the directors of Johns Hopkins, former President Gerald Ford rolls up. He's introduced to me by KPMG, who are the auditors of Johns Hopkins, the auditors of Citibank, and my business partners for the United Nations SEAL program and healthcare with the federal and state governments. They also happen to be the partner of Inslaw Inc. They arrange for me to deal directly with the company set up called United Source America, chaired by former President Gerald Ford, and they agreed to negotiate a $100 million settlement for me against Johns Hopkins institutions, but no, they want to keep 31 to bankroll the election campaign of Jeb Bush. I have all the signed agreements. Christian Hansen and Zachary knew that in 2019. The agreements were signed, and then I discover Gerald Ford is a director of Citibank, together with C. Michael Armstrong. He's the chair of the audit committee, and the other director is John Deutsch and Robert Rubin. Of course, anything to do with Promis and CIA, and it just happens that C. Michael Armstrong's the chairman of Johns Hopkins trustees. So the deal was going to be done, that they were going to negotiate that $100 million with me. I thought that would have been nice to see on Netflix. But they also knew at the same time, Robert Booth Nichols flew out to Australia. He contacted the TV show that's showing the fraud case against Johns Hopkins, impersonating a doctor and wanting to meet with me. He's got evidence that can help my case. against John Hopkins. And this is what he says: I'm currently representing a major US investment firm that's going to be inquiring Healthscope. Turns out it's Frank Gallucci's company. I was previously a major investor in the Baron of Beef restaurant in the Danons with president of Hawthorn Football Club, and it was used as a safe house for CIA mafia during the years of Guggenheim Bank. That wasn't in the TV shows, so we're starting to realise who is this person that owns a steak restaurant. He says, your research is upsetting very powerful Israeli businessmen, and you do not know who you are dealing with until you receive a crowbar to the back of the head. If you continue with your investigations, then you will have the military coming down on you, and all your problems in Australia lead directly to Alexander Haig. Christian Hansen Zachary saw that podcast and the evidence and know that Robert Booth Nichols came 2004 to Australia to threaten my life. Given that I was exposing the Promis software and the transactions at Citibank, and I had the evidence, and Michael Riconosciuto's writing from prison to me for the first time. Pardon me. And here you go. Christian Hansen sent to me, hey Peter, this is 2021, long time no talk, hope you're well. Windy Weaver told me that you've discovered a huge break in the investigation. So curious to learn what you discovered. Signed, Christian Hansen. Dear Peter, we've looked at the materials you provided and watched the Australian news segments about your struggle with John Hopkins. It's absolutely unconscionable what's happened to you. You're an incredible wealth of information about Danny's investigations. I'm really happy we connected again about it. I think it's essential for Trey to get closure. Isn't that high and mighty of them? I'm trying to connect the dots with the things you've been spelling out to me, and I'm hoping to follow up with you about a few things you mentioned before. Do you know when and where the George Oaken and Danny Casolaro meeting was? Do you happen to know where we can see the footage of police looking at the Robert Booth Nichols $250 billion banknote that he's laundering through Citibank and Barclays using the Promis software? You mentioned a list of 10 numbers from the night before Danny died. What were the numbers? Can you explain again their significance? They just happen to be the handwritten numbers of George Swartwood, who's investigating. It turns out he didn't call any of those witnesses who were speaking to him last week. I've interviewed several of them, and they never received a call or were ever interviewed by George Swartwood and the Martinsburg police. In looking at the 1 and 4 million checks, don't you just love that? After watching my podcasts on the BCCI checks. Now, this is 2020. He knows about the checks. He knows about the BCCI transactions. And we find there's a note in the evidence file relating to this. I wonder who put that into the Martinsburg police records, date and time. How can you tell what they're being used for and why? As you can see, the questions he's asking, he has no idea what Danny Casolaro is investigating. Looking forward to follow up more in the future. I then write back, sincerely appreciate our collaborative talents and efforts to assist Trey Casolaro to reopen a Martinsburg police and FBI investigation into the death of Danny Casolaro, to reveal the truth and win justice for Trey and Danny. As you can see, I've uploaded supporting documents to Evernote and the 3 podcasts, my shared cloud folders. I've finished the first 3. I'm now completing 5 podcasts with diagrams, documentary evidence that confirms the details of the rogue CIA agents, BCCI directors, President George H.W. Bush, White House, Treasury, Kuwait royal family were involved and benefited from the death of Danny Casolaro and the missing briefcase of evidence. I'll upload in the next 48 hours. I pray that our collaborative talents, coordinated efforts will be successful to help train his father to reveal the truth and win justice. The public needs to know that these people, Christian Hansen, who thinks he's Danny Casolaro, Trey Treats, who wants to know what's going through the mind of Peter Osborne, lied and deceived us. They produced a non-fiction documentary dramatized about a person called Christian Hansen who thinks that he's Danny Casolaro, having a meltdown, being led astray, and slanders the reputation of Bill Hamilton and Michael Riconosciuto because they think they're easy targets, and now they're trying to do the same to me. And so they wanted to listen to some really good interviews of people who spoke to Danny Casolaro on the last days who believed that he was murdered. And so they're wanting to have access to our recorded interview with Sam Cross and also our recorded interviews with FBI agent Thomas Gates. So I want Gordon Savell to get credit because they're wanting full access to it, and Gordon gives it. We both believe they're going to reveal the truth. And we include not only the recordings but the transcripts to them. And Sam Cross also provided a copy of his 1992 letter of reference and support for Michael Riconosciuto during his trial. Now, isn't this really interesting? Because in my next podcast, I will be showing you and playing you the recorded interviews with them and the letters that clearly show that Michael Riconosciuto wasn't considered a creep by the chief of police at Cabazon, at Indio, who was investigating all the murders. And he believes that Danny Casolaro was murdered and it was a cover-up. And he even goes further. He reveals that Philip Arthur Thompson, known as AKA Jason, was released from prison on his way to assassinate Sam Cross and the attorney, district attorney, who were prosecuting Dr. John P. Phillips for his attempted murder of 5 people. Isn't that interesting? That a criminal that they describe, Philip Arthur Thompson, they watch my podcast. I have all the evidence. The FBI handlers for him, the attorneys that represent him, his partner, their business are the personal attorneys to President Ronald Reagan's family, representing Philip Arthur Thompson, the rapist, the murderer, the assassin that's released from prison. It's interesting, Christian and Zach, you didn't show that evidence because you jumped on my evidence with Philip Arthur Thompson, aka Jason. And even on video, it shows Cherie Seymour going through her files going, oh, yes, I did have a picture of Philip Arthur. And yes, it does say he's Jason. You guys didn't even realise who he is. But if you watched my podcast, you saw. I had all the detailed evidence on that, including I have interviews with an Australian private detective who was investigating the murders of a family's daughter by Philip Arthur Thompson and colleagues, and she tells me categorically he's being protected by 3 agencies. 3 agencies are using him as an informer, and he's a rapist and a murderer. As you can see, a couple of telephone calls. Thanks, Peter. He's a bit tight-lipped here, but good to hear he's thinking from then. Gordon said that he had a longer call with him later, but he didn't record it. Do you know if there's any answers expanded? And that's our recorded interview with FBI agent Thomas Gates. As I had additional ones, it was Thomas Gates that believed that Danny Casolaro was murdered, and he says categorically that the whole investigation by FBI was a big stuff-up. They also realise and confirm they listened to the whole of our interview with Sam Cross. Really interesting and detailed. Then why didn't you play it for the public to hear? I will play it in my next podcast so the public can hear what you left out. See, credibility, integrity, and truth is also revealed by what you didn't show the public because it didn't fit your narrative that you're writing and co-producing with Anne Klink and Cherie Seymour. And you also realise that we have the only recorded interview with William Turner, who is the last person to meet with Danny Casolaro that we know of, other than the mysterious person looking like Joseph Queller entering with a key and a paper bag at 9 p.m. that night, and 12:30 a.m. the first thing in the morning he's found dead. But he handed across all the evidence. In my podcast, you knew that he had met, you even photographed the evidence that he had called and what he had provided. And so you selectively include only part of the information, thus deceiving and misrepresenting the facts to the public audience. And this is what they watched for my first podcast. My interviews with Jack Blum, former investigator BCCI inquiry, Iran-Contra. I telephoned him on the numbers written down and the telephone records of Danny Casolaro. He answered the phone, it's his home number. I asked him, Danny Casolaro was going to Martinsburg to meet with Robert Altman, and he had copies of the BCCI check signed by Adnan Khashoggi and manager Gorbachev in his briefcase. Were Casolaro's copies of the signed BCCI checks and memos that I have recovered from Casolaro's research file, was it ever forwarded as evidence to the BCCI inquiry by the Martinsburg Police, FBI, or US Department of Justice investigators? And Jack Blum says categorically, no. Now that's a really important question for Anne Klink. Did she give that damaging evidence that Danny had to the Department of Justice, the Martinsburg Police, or the FBI, BCCI investigators that came to her house to go through the folders that she's holding? Because apparently they didn't give it to Jack Blum or Senator Kerry. And then I asked, do you think Danny Casolaro was in danger having copies of these signed BCCI checks with him in Martinsburg, including the Monte Carlo transactions? And Jack Blum says, if Danny was down in Virginia in CIA territory and waving all those checks around, what did he think would happen? I think that is a categorical answer. There was a motive to kill Danny Casolaro, and the evidence suggests that he was meeting with Robert Altman, who reluctantly agreed to meet with him because he was threatening to give the checks and the transactions to Senator Kerry. And so my first podcast that they watch, I said all roads seem to lead to Kuwait. The two people all around him is Joseph Queller, returning from Desert Storm, mysteriously appointed by Business Risk International, knows everything about the Promis software, but also knows personally Peter Wiedniks and someone at Senator Byrd's office, and he's going to set this meeting up for him. The other person that's all over him has returned from Kuwait, in fact the Dominican Republic, boasting to William Hamilton that a congressman has appointed him as the manager of all the funds for the reconstruction of Kuwait. And they're going to be using the Dominican Republic as a launching base for those reconstruction projects. So pretty amazing. In addition, into Danny's files is this handwritten about the money laundering of Noriega's drugs through Florida, where 5 BCCI officers are arrested. And also, he's aware that money, 80 million, was transferred 2 weeks earlier through BCCI accounts by the Kuwait royal family directly to international terrorist Abu Nidal. It's really interesting, isn't it, when you look at these names? My podcasts, please watch podcast number 1, goes into detail of the significance of that. I just want to bring to your attention, you've seen what's in the Martinsburg police records that we were prevented from getting. There's confirmation that Christian Hansen and Zachary had that 2 years before they released their finished producing the Netflix series, and they didn't show any of this evidence that I provided or was in the Martinsburg police. The evidence is quite clear in my podcast. The checks were financed by the Kuwait royal family. It turns out that Adnan Khashoggi wasn't successful in getting the finance approved by Tiny Roland, so it was financed by the chairman of Kuwait Airlines, which is Faisal Faluj, who's the secret owner of First American Bank and involved in the Capcom transactions of laundering Noriega's drugs through Florida. And more importantly, Robert Altman holds the power of attorney for him. That is definitive in the BCCI report. In addition, the court cases I present is Robert Sensi declares and testifies that he is working for William Casey, William Wilson, Ambassador for the Vatican, Robert Gray, owner of Gray & Co., and also Hill and Knowlton, and he previously worked for Clint Murchison Jr., who's on the board of Fitco with Robert Booth Nichols, Robert Mayhew, and George Pender. He confirms that the checks 4 and 1 were financed through First American Bank shares and the chairman of Kuwait Airlines, who he worked for at the Watergate Hotel, and he was also working for the Kuwait ambassador at the office in Watergate. And there shows you the indictment of Robert Altman, Clark Clifford, and the secret owner Faisal Saud Al-Falaj, where Robert Altman has the power of attorney for him as the secret owner of First American Bank shares. It also confirms that it was involving BCCI fraud going through World Bank accounts and IMF funds, categorically. And that was the checks that Danny Casolaro had in his folders, and Klink had those. Danny Casolaro had them in his briefcase, and there's the card of Robert Sensi. There's the transactions of Monte Carlo. As you saw in the memo, in the Martinsburg police, it shows a transaction of 1, 2, 3, 4 payments of 3 million, and also a check for 1 and 4 million. Total 17 through Monte Carlo account. That was what Danny Casolaro had, and there's the letters of credit from BCCI and also branches in Monte Carlo for Khashoggi and Ghorbanifar. This is the lead suspect who we believe murdered. He's an assassin. CIA, Special Forces, working for Business Risk International. They're the documents that we provided to Christian Hansen and Zachary whilst they are doing the production in 2018 when they start. They had that confirmation of the coincidence, but they also had this. I have my email correspondence to them that the suspicion is that on July 22, 2 weeks before Danny dies, Kroll's associates announced that they were going to do a full acquisition of Business Risk International that employed CIA agent, military intelligence officer Joe Sequella. There's the announcement of it, and then there's the press release Kroll's Associates is contracted to the Kuwait royal family and US Treasury with James Baker to recover all the stolen gold bullion and art, and also recover over $1 billion of assets of Saddam Hussein. And that they're tracking Kuwait assets hidden by Iraq's Saddam Hussein. What I have is the press release in the capital of Australia that James Baker confirms that he's using Rupert Murdoch's Computer Power Group software for the planning of Operation Desert Storm while he's working in Saudi Arabia. That I will reveal in a podcast to show how important the Promis software for Swift banking was with artificial intelligence for tracking all the assets of Saddam Hussein and the banks. And of course, I gave Christian Hansen this as well. It's the obituary of when he passed away in 2014. We noticed that he didn't provide any of my evidence relating to Joseph Queller and the sketch, but though he was happy to interview the son, who had nothing but praise and positive things to say. And it shows that he really did work for Pentagon, operations down in Africa, Latin America, and Southwest Asia, military intelligence office, special forces. It also shows that he was based in Venezuela, Bosnia, Africa, and Saudi Arabia, and deployed to Operation Desert Storm, 101st Airborne Division. Then assigned across to Southcom. Worked directly for the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and he was a political military officer. Isn't that interesting? Political military officer. And he also had a career with NATO headquarters, Civils Affairs Director, Special Operations Command Europe. Also worked National Defence Intelligence College and ideally suited for covert ops. He worked within the intelligence international community in international locations on assignments that for good reason still remain discreet. We know and we heard that he was a wet operative, an assassin. And Christian Hansen and Zachary also downloaded my podcast and recorded interviews and contact details for Wendy, the last girlfriend. And she confirms. I also interviewed Douglas Vaughan and James Ridge before he passed away. So obviously they couldn't interview James and his assistant, but I'd done that years before they did their Netflix series. And so as you can see, it was me that worked out the links there for Follow the Money and transactions, and all leads to Kuwait Royal Family and Department of Treasury. The last girlfriend confirms that she was whisked off for the week that Danny died and staying at the Watergate Hotel with the Crown Prince, Prime Minister. We were able to identify him, and she confirmed, and there's a picture of him with Ronald Reagan thanking George Bush for Operation Desert Storm in Kuwait, and there he is meeting with James Baker, who's got the Promis software, Swift banking software developed by Rupert Murdoch's company with Hadron Inc. to recover all the stolen gold bullion and seize all the assets of Saddam Hussein. And Christian Hansen also had not only her telephone numbers, but also all the details of her application. In 2020, she made an application for access to information to CIA to see if they had any records. That should have been on the Netflix series. And look at this, I gave them this as well. Even George Swartwood in his own handwriting. Danny Casolaro, George Pittaway, met Ted Shackley's girlfriend on July 4th, 1991, and took her home and found her looking through his papers. Jim Ridgway spoke to Danny's last girlfriend, works at a restaurant in Herndon. Windy, but it's not Windy Weaver. I have confirmation in the records that George Swartwood had Windy Golden's telephone number. She confirms in her interviews with me in 2019 that she never received a telephone call and was never interviewed by the Martinsburg Police or the FBI or the Department of Justice. And the most important thing is 4 days before Danny dies, it's discovered that Dwayne Claridge and Richard Secord and Oliver North and Ted Shackley, manager and Michael Ledeen had all lied about their knowledge of the tow missiles, the checks that Danny Casolaro has. And there it is, the 6th of August 1991, Iran-Contra Hawk tow missile deal. Prosecutors target Dwayne Claridge, Robert Gates, Oliver North and Richard Secord about lying about their knowledge of this tow missile deal. Now, if you've got all these people being indicted 4 days before Danny's killed, and my recorded interviews with Windy Weaver, she confirms that while she was living with Danny Casolaro, she would answer the phone and it was Richard Secord calling to speak with Danny. So Richard Secord was very interested in what Danny was investigating. But Danny's got the checks, the transactions, and the records. And these powerful people, Robert Gates, Dwayne Claridge, Oliver North, Ted Shackley, Michael Ledeen and Richard Secord are all going to be indicted for lying about their knowledge of these transactions, and Danny Casolaro's got the smoking gun. I believe there's your motive to have him killed. And I will play at the end an interview by our credible investigative journalist, John Pilcher, interviewing Dwayne Claridge on the lengths that he's prepared to go to kill innocent people, thousands of them, in the name of national security. And in follow-up podcasts, I'll show you that Danny Casolaro had a second smoking gun. It was a prospectus for a private counter-terrorism consulting group that had Dwayne Claridge, a director of Wacken Hut, and Lawrence Barsala, the key attorney for CIA who covers up October Surprise, Iran-Contra, the Noriega money laundering of the drugs with the 5 BCCI directors, and the Pentagon fraud documents that William Turner was providing to Danny Casolaro in the car park. So in the last days, all roads lead to Kuwait. It's the tow missiles, the financing of it, the indictment of all the BCCI directors and attorneys of First American Bank shares, particularly Faisal Farlouj, who financed those checks when he was the chairman of Kuwait Airlines for William Casey with Robert Sensi and Robert Gray. And they definitively knew that in 2004, my damaging evidence that's independent of Michael, independent of Bill Hamilton about the Promis software, brought Robert Booth Nichols to Australia in 2004 to threaten my life. And they also had full access to all my podcasts showing the corporate links of the Cabazon Casino, Wacken Hut Cabazon Arms, with Armtech, Meridian Arms, and recovery technologies that Michael owned with Paul Maraska and Michael Riconosciuto, with all the transactions and arms deals done in Australia with Australian military, the Army, setting up weapons factories, but more important, the transactions they had with Southern Goldfields for the processing of gold bullion through Perth Mint in Western Australia. And on the board is Peter Briggs and Jeffrey Stokes. And Jeffrey Stokes is the chairman of Mining Resources with directors Michael Hand and Frank Nugan, and also the Armtech arms deal, which will be revealed very shortly by credible Australian journalists, relates to the $6 million cheque being transferred across from Dr. Earl Bryan to Alan Bond in a royal commission. And so I don't think there was any reason to doubt that Danny Casolaro had all the evidence, because it's valid. All the names, the details he was going to do when coming to Australia related to the $4 billion Arab loan. He has the names of Harry Gillam, Eric Siakals, Frank Colucci, Robert Booth Nichols, Ted Shackley, and Sir Dennis Kendall are all intimately involved in the dismissal of the Whitlam government and the $4 billion Arab loans affair. And I've traced all of the bank accounts for this transaction with them to the banks of CIA, including the original founders of First American Bank Shares, BCCI. And on the day that Danny Casolaro is found dead, Thomas Gates confirms that as part of the alibi to rule Robert Booth Nichols, he calls Tony Casolaro to give his condolences, Wendy Weaver to give his condolences for the death of Danny. He's calling from his apartment in London at 5 Half Moon Street, Mayfair, London. And it just happens to be the same apartment where Sir Harry Gillam was selling all the damaging memos from the CIA MI6 $4 billion loan to Rupert Murdoch's papers and other Australian papers to bring down the Whitlam government. My podcast and video is him in that apartment talking about that transaction that Robert Booth Nichols was involved with. And it turns out that Robert Booth Nichols owns that apartment, and it's on the registration of his license to carry a concealed machine gun together with his other addresses in Australia. And Danny Casolaro was going to be revealing all of Nugan Bank and the $4 billion Arab loans affair involving Robert Booth Nichols, Frank Colucci, Ted Shackley, Michael Hand. And so let's summarise that point. They had everything. They knew what was in the box of evidence. They got it. They act and pretend it's all a surprise. There's a sketch of someone that looks like CIA agent, former CIA agent, military intelligence officer, special forces, Joseph Queller, who we know is a wet agent, an assassin, setting the meetings up for Danny Casolaro in Martinsburg. But you've now seen all the other evidence that they had with the promises they were going to produce a documentary to tell the truth, and they didn't. They deceived and lied to Trey Casolaro and me, and they totally misled the public. Visit my website to see the first 9 podcasts with summaries of all the evidence that Christian Hansen and Zachary Treats had full access to whilst producing the Netflix series over 4 years. and don't believe what they said. The only person in the room with Danny Casolaro that could have killed Danny Casolaro is Danny Casolaro. And we've never seen any evidence that confirms he didn't commit suicide. And we believe it's 51% versus 49% probability that he committed suicide versus he was murdered. Young children at primary school, early secondary school, know more about probability than Christian Hansen and Zachary Treats. And so I'm going to finish off with the interview with Dwayne Claridge, who is being indicted for lying about his knowledge of the Hawk Toe missile deals 4 days before Danny's found dead, his briefcase with the BCCI checks and Monte Carlo transactions are missing, and the evidence and copies of those in the records that Anne Klink had taken from Danny's house were never given to the BCCI investigation team, Senator Kerry and Jack Blum, appear to have not been given to the Martinsburg police, appear were not given to the FBI, BCCI investigators, and definitely appears not given to the US Department of Justice, who are investigating, is there any evidence of a motive, threats, evidence that would have Danny Casolaro murdered? And they come to the conclusion that he was depressed, that he took some shoelaces from shoes, 2 plastic bags to put over his head, and some razor blades, travelled to Martinsburg because he was just so depressed, and he committed suicide.
Dwayne Claridge was head of the CIA's Latin American division in the early 1980s.
Chile, the only reason it exists is because of Pinochet.
At a huge human price.
What human price? Give me a break.
The thousands who were disappeared and murdered?
Thousands? You count them. What thousands?
Well,
and
I've
don't
seen...
talk to me about truth commissions.
I've seen their names in the cemetery in Santiago.
Yeah,
you're saying they're
thousands. They aren't thousands.
Well...
There aren't thousands, sir.
It was a period in which almost everybody in the present situation regards as a dark time, in which the CIA played a major role.
That's right. They played a major role in overthrowing, what's his name?
What's his name was Salvador Allende.
Yeah, fine. Okay.
He was democratically elected.
Right. Okay.
Is that okay to overthrow a democratically elected government? Is it okay?
It depends on what your national security interests are.
Are you denying that Pinochet caused huge suffering in that country?
I don't buy. That he committed crimes, I agree.
But it's worth it.
Huh?
Is that what you're saying? Yes, those crimes are worth it?
Yeah. Sometimes, unfortunately, things have to be changed in a rather ugly way.
According to the Truth Commission and a whole swathe of human...
well, come on, John. If this is where we're going, you're wasting my time. That's all bullshit. Those people all had agendas.
So it was bullshit that the Salvadorian military were murdering tens of thousands of people.
I bet you can't count more than 200 in the whole 10 or 12 years. You're taking the stuff from these propaganda mills. And I'm not interested.
What are the propaganda mills?
All these things, this truth thing and all that, they're nothing but propaganda mills.
Do you really think they're...
I didn't know so.
Are they all conning us, lying us? Yeah, Amnesty International?
Amnesty International's right in the middle of it.
What right have you, when I mean you, the CIA, the United States government, or any foreign power, what right do you have to do what you do in other countries? What
National
right?
security interests.
But that's a divine right, isn't it? Because the people that you do it to have no say in this.
Yeah, well, that's just tough. We are going to protect ourselves, and we're going to go on protecting ourselves because we end up protecting all of you. And let's not forget that.
Right. Right, no, I won't.
We'll intervene whenever we decide it's in our national security interest to intervene. And if you don't like it, lump it. Get used to it, world. We're not going to put up with nonsense. And if our interests are threatened, we're going to do it.